They say you can't pick your neighbors, but no one warned me mine would be the four-wheeled devil in yoga pants driving an HOA-branded SUV straight through my soul and my private ranch road. I knew I'd reached my breaking point when I found her tire tracks carved into the fresh dirt I'd graded just hours before, my private property sign snapped in half like a breadstick at an Italian wedding. That was the moment I decided. I was done being nice. I was done with warnings. It was time to dig a hole so deep she'd fall in and maybe get a moment of reflection on the way down. It all started innocently enough. My ranch is tucked at the edge of a sleepy little town in Texas where cows outnumber people and everyone mostly minds their own business. I've owned the land for 15 years, and the road that runs alongside it, technically mine, was nothing but a dirt trail I'd kept in shape with my own two hands and a beat-up grader I bought at auction for $300. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. That road was the artery of my land, leading from the main gate to the barn, chicken coop, and the modest little house I call home. No one ever used it but me, my cows, and the occasional Amazon delivery guy brave enough to risk the mud. Then came Karen. Karen arrived like a biblical plague, complete with loud opinions, unsolicited advice, and an SUV that she drove like a battering ram through everything decent in the world. She moved into the brand-new HOA subdivision that popped up on the other side of the creek last year, a real eyesore of identical beige boxes and front lawns sprayed so green they looked radioactive. They called it Whispering Pines. There ain't a pine in sight. She found my road the way a mosquito finds bare skin. At first, it was once or twice, harmless I thought, probably just someone lost. But then it became a daily event. Morning, noon, evening, always with that smug wave as she drove past me like I was some background character in her personal rom-com. I stood there holding a feed bucket, watching her SUV kick up dust over the spots I'd just leveled, the same way you might watch a raccoon tear through your garbage, disgusted but fascinated by the audacity. I put up a sign. Simple. Black letters, white background. Private road, no trespassing. She tore it down the next day. I found it folded in half and tucked behind one of my hay bales like she thought I'd never notice. I did. I always notice. The next time I saw her, I waved her down. I tried to be polite, civil even. Told her this was private property and that the road wasn't some shortcut to the highway. She smiled with all the grace of a piranha and said, "Oh honey, we're all neighbors now. What's a little dirt between friends? A little dirt? Lady, that dirt is my morning meditation. That dirt is the result of years of hard work, blood, and more busted shovels than I care to count. But I let it go. I figured maybe she'd get the message, maybe she'd back off. She didn't. What she did next made me understand what true rage feels like. I was coming back from the feed store one day and saw a group of HOA members standing in a semicircle near the start of the road on my property. Karen was holding a clipboard like she was hosting a game show. I slowed my truck, rolled down the window, and asked what was going on. She said they were holding an emergency vote to make the road shared access for community convenience. I laughed. Out loud. Then I realized she wasn't joking. That night I found a letter in my mailbox. Not from the county. Not from a lawyer. From Karen. On HOA letterhead. It was printed in Comic Sans. She explained, very cheerfully, that the board has voted to integrate your road into Whispering Pines travel access, and that any resistance would be interpreted as non-compliance with community guidelines. She even signed it with a little smiley face. That was the moment the switch flipped. No more talking. No more signs. I wasn't going to argue with someone who thought Comic Sans was a legal font. I sat on my porch that night with my dog Boomer curled up at my feet, staring at that road. It stretched out like a red carpet of disrespect. The moon was bright, the air smelled like hay and cow sweat, and all I could think about was how satisfying it would be to give that road a little upgrade. Something memorable. Something that would make her think twice. I sipped my beer, and by the time I drained the bottle, the plan was already digging itself into my brain. Next morning, I called my buddy Clint. Clint's a big man with a beard like a grizzly bear, and the kind of mind that understands vengeance as a form of art. Used to work in construction, until he punched his foreman for calling his backhoe a toy. My kind of guy. I told him what was going on. He listened, real quiet, then nodded and said, "You want a ditch she'll remember for the rest of her life?" I said, "I want the Grand Canyon, Clint." And just like that, the trench was born. We started at dawn. 2 old men, a backhoe, and a righteous grudge. We dug deep, deeper than necessary, deeper than reasonable. The kind of trench you could hide a dinosaur skeleton in. We made sure to position it just around the bend in the road, out of sight until it was too late. We camouflaged it with plywood, then a layer of dirt, then some brush on top for good measure. It looked natural. It looked perfect. And when it was done, we sat back with sweet tea and lawn chairs and waited for the storm to come. Karen wouldn't know what hit her. Clint and I stood there admiring our creation like a couple of artists staring at a freshly finished masterpiece. The trench was a thing of beauty, about 3 feet wide and nearly 4 feet deep, just enough to catch an overconfident SUV without causing real harm. We weren't out to kill anyone, just humble them. Or humiliate them, preferably both. The plywood cover was sturdy enough to support light foot traffic, but not a 2-ton suburban assault vehicle driven by the queen of entitlement. We sprinkled loose dirt on top and threw down a few leaves and twigs to sell the illusion. It looked like any other patch of dirt road. Ordinary. Innocent. Deadly. We didn't have to wait long. By noon the next day, Karen was back at it, barreling down the path like she was racing for a lifetime supply of HOA-approved grass seed. She had the windows down and her music blaring. Some kind of motivational podcast about channeling your inner boss energy. The irony was so thick I could have bottled it and sold it at the farmer's market. Clint nudged me from where we sat behind a row of hay bales. I leaned forward in my chair, heart pounding like I was about to watch the final scene of a revenge movie. Then it happened. The moment her front tires hit the trench, the plywood cracked like thunder. Her SUV dipped forward violently, slamming into the front edge of the hole before the back tires even realized what was going on. The whole vehicle jerked down and forward, the airbag deploying with a loud pop that echoed through the field. A puff of white exploded inside the cabin, and for one glorious moment, I saw Karen's shocked, puffed-up face framed by powder and panic. Clint wheezed beside me, trying to contain his laughter. I clapped a hand over my mouth and nearly fell out of my chair. It was like a ballet of karmic justice unfolding in slow motion. The SUV teetered with its front end lodged in the trench, back tires spinning uselessly in the air. Karen's door flew open, and she stumbled out, clutching her phone and shouting something about sabotage, booby traps, and pressing charges. She limped in a dramatic fashion that suggested nothing was wrong but her pride. She didn't see us. We stayed low, backs pressed against the barn wall, shaking with suppressed laughter. Clint reached into his cooler and handed me a soda like we were watching a backyard wrestling match. It wasn't just petty revenge. It was a show. And we had front row seats. Karen stood there flailing her arms, trying to flag down someone, anyone, to witness her tragedy. She took about 20 pictures, each one more dramatic than the last, before stomping back into the SUV to try and reverse out. But it was stuck. Proper stuck. The trench had claimed its prize, and it wasn't letting go. I gave it about 15 minutes before the sheriff showed up. Not because I called him. Because Karen did. She had him on speed dial, apparently. Sheriff Cole pulled up in his cruiser, lights off, looking more annoyed than concerned. He stepped out, took one look at the scene, then turned to Karen with the weary expression of a man who had seen this circus before and didn't want a ticket. She started in on him immediately, spinning a tale of malicious intent, sabotage, and how I'd endangered the community. Sheriff Cole nodded patiently, then turned to me as I walked over, hands in the air like I was approaching a wild animal. I explained calmly, in full detail, How this was my land, my road, and how the trench was part of a soil erosion project I'd been planning for weeks. Totally legal. Entirely reasonable. I even had a laminated county map with property lines outlined in bright red, just in case. Sheriff Cole squinted at the trench, scratched his chin, and said, "Looks like erosion prevention to me." Karen nearly exploded. Her face turned the color of a ripe tomato, and she started waving her phone around like a sword. She demanded an investigation. She demanded he arrest me. She even suggested I had set a vehicular trap, which made Clint snort so hard he choked on his root beer. Cole wasn't buying it. He pointed out that she had no business being on the road to begin with, that it was, in fact, trespassing, that she had, on several occasions, been told not to use the road, and that continuing to do so was, legally speaking, a bad idea. Karen stormed off to the passenger seat of her SUV, arms crossed, pouting like a toddler who'd been told she couldn't have dessert. Cole gave me a look, one that said, "You didn't hear this from me," and murmured, "Maybe dig a few more of those erosion trenches." I nodded solemnly. "Nature's unpredictable, Sheriff." As the tow truck arrived, called by Karen, of course, the comedy of errors reached new heights. The driver took one look at the trench, shook his head, and radioed for backup. While waiting, he tried to reposition his truck and ended up with one wheel caught on the edge of the trench. Not stuck, but close enough to make him rethink his life choices. Clint stood nearby, sipping his soda like a man watching a fireworks show. We didn't even need popcorn. The universe was doing all the work. Karen, meanwhile, started pacing again. This time she was on the phone, shouting into the receiver about escalation, legal recourse, and something about punitive damages. I figured she was either calling a lawyer or her therapist. Maybe both. That night, I found a folded letter stuffed in my mailbox again. No stamp. Just Karen's handwriting and a fresh wave of passive-aggressive fury. She accused me of conducting a targeted rural assault, and said the HOA would be pursuing all available legal remedies. She ended the note with, "Consider this your final warning." I chuckled and filed it away in my new folder labeled, Karen, Evidence. Clint suggested I start selling copies of the trench footage online. We had everything recorded from 2 different angles thanks to the trail cams I'd set up. The lighting was perfect, the reactions priceless, and Karen's expression when the airbag popped? Cinematic gold. I didn't respond to the letter. There was no need. The trench had spoken louder than any words ever could. But I knew Karen wasn't done. People like her don't back down. They double down. And something told me the real storm hadn't even started yet. So I spent the next morning reinforcing the trench, just in case. Nature is unpredictable, after all. And Karen? She was a force of chaos you couldn't underestimate. The thing about Karen is, she doesn't learn from her mistakes, she escalates them. Most folks would see their SUV wedged in a trench, airbag deployed, a sheriff shaking his head, and think maybe, just maybe, it was time to back off. But not Karen. For her, it was just the beginning of a full-blown vendetta. Within 48 hours of the trench incident, she had launched what I came to call the Great Revenge Tour, a one-woman crusade fueled by rage, entitlement, and an alarming misunderstanding of basic property law. It started with another letter, of course. This one was a glossy, full-color HOA document, complete with the Whispering Pines logo and her signature printed in obnoxiously large cursive at the bottom. It accused me of creating hazardous environmental conditions that posed a danger to community well-being. She cited local ordinances, most of which didn't exist, and demanded that I fill in the trench and grant easement access to Whispering Pines. She even added a fine, $100 per day the road remained closed. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my cornbread. Then came the visit from Doug. Doug was Karen's cousin, a doughy man in an ill-fitting suit who introduced himself as the HOA's legal advisor. He drove up in a Prius, stepped out holding a leather briefcase he probably bought off Craigslist, and tried to serve me what looked like official legal papers. The man had mustard on his tie. I didn't even bother reading the documents. I told him the trench was part of an erosion control initiative approved by my property insurance provider, which was technically true thanks to a vague clause and a friendly chat with my agent. Doug blinked like I'd just cast a spell and muttered something about reviewing statutes, before getting back in his car and scraping the bumper on a tree root on the way out. By now, Clint was staying on the ranch full-time, partly because he wanted to help, and partly because he didn't want to miss whatever came next. He set up a second set of cameras, this time with motion detection and night vision. I half expected Karen to sneak in under cover of darkness and fill the trench with cement. She didn't, but what she did next was somehow worse. She called in the local paper. A few days later, I opened the front page and nearly dropped my coffee. There it was, a full article titled "Local Man Accused of Building Traps to Stop Community Progress." It featured a photo of Karen standing dramatically next to her half-sunken SUV, arms crossed, with a look that screamed misunderstood victim. The article painted her as a pioneer of suburban unity, bravely trying to connect two communities until her efforts were sabotaged by a hostile landowner with a vendetta against the HOA system. My name wasn't printed, but the description, reclusive rancher with a history of anti-HOA sentiment, left no doubt. Clint thought it was hilarious. I was mostly annoyed. The phone started ringing. Neighbors, old friends, even a woman I dated in college, who thought the article made me sound like a vigilante hero. I told her it wasn't exactly the Batman origin story, but I appreciated the sentiment. Karen, though, wasn't done making a scene. A few days later, she hired a tow company to come retrieve her SUV without even telling me. I heard the rumble of the truck around 10 in the morning and walked out to find two guys scratching their heads next to the trench. They'd brought a standard flatbed and clearly didn't realize what they were dealing with. The lead guy, a bearded fellow named Ray, took one look and said, "We're gonna need a crane or something. This thing's buried." Karen showed up 5 minutes later, storming over in a tracksuit and oversized sunglasses like a reality TV villain. She ordered them to just pull it out and accused me of sabotaging the trench further since her last visit. I reminded her, calmly and without a hint of sarcasm, that erosion waits for no one. Against better judgment, Ray decided to try anyway. He backed up the tow truck, connected the winch, and gave it a go. The sound of creaking metal filled the air, and for a brief second it looked like it might work, until the edge of the trench gave out and the back end of the tow truck tipped forward, the rear tires lifting an inch off the ground. Ray hit the brakes fast, swore loudly, and unhooked everything. He looked at me, then at Karen, and said, "Lady, this thing ain't coming out unless you get a helicopter." Karen screamed. Not a polite scream. Not even a frustrated scream. It was the sound of a banshee losing a custody battle with gravity. She threw her sunglasses on the ground and stormed off again, muttering about lawyers and lawsuits and maybe even witchcraft, I'm not sure. That evening, Clint and I were sitting on the porch watching the sun dip behind the hills when he said something that gave me pause. What if she finds something in the county records? I looked at him sideways. Like what? I don't know. Easements. Old agreements. Hidden technicalities. These HOA types have a way of sniffing out loopholes when they're losing. I didn't sleep well that night. The trench, the sheriff's visit, even the newspaper article hadn't bothered me. But the idea of a forgotten easement? That was the kind of thing that could actually cause trouble. So the next morning, I drove down to the county clerk's office, signed in, and asked to look at every property document tied to my land and the adjacent subdivision. It took hours, pages and pages of ancient typewritten records, yellowed paper, and hand-drawn map. Finally, tucked between two surveys from the 1970s, I found it. An easement contract. My stomach sank, until I actually read it. The easement did exist. But it wasn't in favor of Whispering Pines. It was the opposite. According to the document, the developers of the subdivision had agreed, before building, to construct their own access road to the highway, and to never rely on existing private farm roads for community use. It was signed, notarized, and still valid. I sat there stunned for a moment, then laughed. Not just a chuckle, a full-belly laugh that made the county clerk raise her eyebrows. Karen had been fighting this hard for a shortcut she legally had no right to use. Her entire crusade was based on a fantasy. I made copies. Lots of them. I emailed a set to myself. I even laminated one and slid it into my glove compartment. Karen had brought the drama, the press, and the petty chaos. But I had the documents, the trench, and the law. The war wasn't over. But I had just found my secret weapon. The look on Karen's face when I handed her a laminated copy of the easement document was the kind of thing you bottle and save for a rainy day. She stood there on the edge of my property, clutching a venti-iced something and squinting at the paper like she couldn't quite read it through the fog of her own entitlement. I didn't say a word. I let the words on the page do the talking. When her eyes landed on the clause that stated, in very clear language, that Whispering Pines was legally obligated to build its own access road and could not use existing private ranch roads for community passage, she went dead quiet. For 5 glorious seconds, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and a cow mooing in the distance. Then she tried to crumple the page, only to realize it was laminated. That only made it better. That afternoon, I drove into town and met with a real lawyer. Not Karen's cousin Doug, who still hadn't figured out how to spell jurisdiction, but a seasoned local attorney named Marla Pritchard. She'd been handling ranch and land disputes in the county longer than Whispering Pines had even existed. When I showed her the document, she gave me a slow nod, then leaned back in her chair and said, "Well, Mr. Buckner, looks like you're the proud owner of the high ground. Legally, morally, and topographically. We filed a cease and desist against the HOA, specifically targeting their attempts to claim access to my road and the nonsense fine they tried to slap me with. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to make it clear I wasn't someone you could walk over, or drive over. So we added a civil suit for trespassing, property damage, and harassment." Marla filed the paperwork with a smile that could curdle milk. Karen was served papers 2 days later, just as she was trying to pose next to the trench for what I can only assume was her latest social media campaign. Clint caught the whole thing on camera. The deputy walked up, handed her the envelope, and tipped his hat while she sputtered something about freedom of movement. Then she screamed at a nearby squirrel. The video went viral within hours. Apparently, there's a large online community of people who get real joy out of watching entitled HOA presidents get smacked down by actual law. The clip was titled, "Karen Gets Served and Screams at Wildlife." It had 3 million views by sundown. Things started unraveling for her after that. Whispering Pines held a surprise HOA meeting. No fancy brunch, no yoga mats, just a bunch of tired homeowners who'd had enough. Turns out, she'd been a thorn in their sides too. She'd fined people for mismatched mulch, ticketed a teenager for playing drums too loudly at noon, and tried to get a neighbor evicted for having a Halloween display that she called spiritually unsettling. That last one involved a 9-foot skeleton dressed as Elvis. Her power was slipping fast, and she knew it. Still, Karen didn't go down without a fight. She filed a countersuit against me claiming emotional distress, vehicle damage, and loss of social capital. Her lawyer was, once again, her cousin Doug. In court, he tried to argue that my trench had been a malicious act of aggression aimed at destabilizing a peaceful community. The judge asked him if he had any case law or precedent to support that. Doug replied, "No, but I have feelings." The judge blinked twice, and then turned to me and asked if I had anything to add. I simply handed over the laminated easement and a copy of the video of Karen driving past my no trespassing signs on 5 different occasions. We won. Handily. The judge not only threw out Karen's countersuit but ruled in my favor on every count. The HOA was ordered to pay for the damage to my road, replace the broken signage, and issue a formal apology in writing. Karen was removed from her post as president and barred from holding any HOA leadership role for the next 10 years. When the judgment was read, she stood up, shouted something about corruption, and stormed out of the courtroom, tripping over her own purse on the way. But it wasn't just the courtroom where she lost. Online, her reputation as a tyrannical HOA queen became a meme. People photoshopped her screaming face into historical events, space missions, and cartoons. Clint made a t-shirt that said, "Trenched by Karen," and wore it to the farmer's market. It sold out in 3 hours. Even Sheriff Cole stopped by to buy one. The HOA, desperate to avoid another trenchgate, finally began construction on their own access road. It was supposed to take 3 months. It took 5, thanks to rain, budget cuts, and one unexpected delay involving a rattlesnake nest that Clint may or may not have relocated near the construction site. I didn't ask, and he didn't say. When the road was finally done, there was a ribbon-cutting ceremony with balloons and awkward speeches from HOA board members pretending they hadn't tried to annex my property 6 months earlier. Karen didn't show up. Rumor had it she was selling her house and moving to Florida to start fresh. I wished Florida good luck. They were going to need it. I celebrated in my own way. Installed a brand new gate at the start of my road, solar-powered, motion-sensing, and equipped with cameras. I posted a new sign, too. It read, "Private property. Trespassers will be trenched." It was half warning, half joke. But around here, folks knew better than to test either half. Clint moved into the old guest house behind the barn and stayed on full-time. Said he liked the peace, the quiet, and the occasional battle with lunatic. We built a little porch off the front of the guest house and sat out there most evenings, sipping sweet tea and watching the sun drop behind the hills. The trench, by the way, is still there. Not filled in. Not forgotten. I planted some wildflowers around it. Made it into a feature. The cows avoid it. The tourists ask about it. It's got its own legend now. Sometimes I think about how quickly it all spiraled. How one woman's obsession with control turned a peaceful road into a war zone. But mostly I think about how satisfying it is to stand your ground, especially when that ground is dug out just deep enough to catch the wheels of entitlement. Karen didn't just fall into a hole. She fell into her own hubris, and for once the land itself decided to push back.